Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to do things slightly differently. So you may have noticed that we didn't have the sonic boom at the beginning of today's episode. There have actually been quite a lot of complaints about that, would you believe? People saying that it's blowing their speakers. But if you watch my videos, you know that it starts every single video in the same way. So why would you turn your speakers up right at the start and then be surprised when the big boom kicks in? Anyway, I digress. The reason I wanted to talk to you today is to talk about the change in strategy in terms of Ukraine's response to what Russia has been doing to all of its infrastructure over the last few months. If you've been following the mainstream media, you'll have noticed that Russia have been bombarding power stations in Ukraine in an effort to take them out, to put cities in darkness and to cause further problems for the Ukrainian economy. And as a result of that, Ukraine has now changed its tactics. Over the last couple of months, Ukraine has launched hundreds of unmanned drone attacks against Russian oil and gas infrastructure. And if you've been following the channel, you'll know that I've posted multiple videos talking about this. And this change in strategy has been a really clever move from Ukraine's point of view, because as it stands at the moment, Russia has significantly more firepower than Ukraine. So in a fair fight, there's only going to be one winner. This is similar to you being challenged by the biggest guy in school to a fight in the playground in front of everybody. You certainly don't want to get into that unless you're some sort of ninja. But if you wait till after school, till the guy's gone home, and then you take everything out of his desk and set fire to it and don't admit to that, then obviously he's going to be pretty cheesed off in the morning. And he may suspect that it was you that did it, but he wouldn't have any evidence, and therefore he's probably not going to challenge you again, because he knows that if he does, you're probably going to set fire to more of his stuff. And that's the sort of tactics that Ukraine are following now. Rather than going for a head-to-head combat, they're retaliating against Russia in exactly the same way as Russia has been hitting them. And what we've seen over the last 24 hours is that Ukraine has launched hundreds of drone attacks in 8 different regions of Russia, targeting energy infrastructure. And this is a complete switch away from the previous strategy whereby they were focusing in on oil and gas facilities. And I think that's a really smart move, because Russia came out and said, well, firstly, we're going to shoot down all of these drones because we've got the weaponry to do that. And secondly, as you may have seen in a recent video that I posted, they instructed all of the oil and gas companies to go and hire their own private armies. And obviously that comes with inherent risks, because if you're telling people to set up their own army and then you don't agree with any of the policies that come in the future, you've got your own army to do something about it. But while the oil and gas companies have been away recruiting all of their mercenaries to set up their own battalions, Ukraine has switched its focus and now started focusing on energy infrastructure. So over the last 24 hours, Ukraine have struck 3 power stations in different regions in Russia. And some of these regions don't have any oil and gas facilities within them. So what Ukraine has done here is change its strategy completely to catch Russia off guard, to catch it with its pants down. Russia is currently busy setting up all of its defence systems around the oil and gas facilities. And if Ukraine now targets something different, it's going to throw a real spanner into the work from Russia's point of view, because they're now going to have to come up with a new strategy. Maybe they'll get all of the energy power people to set up their own armies as well. What we could have is hundreds and thousands of armies all across Russia, all trying to defend all of these facilities against the incoming drones. But in all seriousness, what we're seeing here is Ukraine being nimble and changing its tactics to really put Russia on the back foot. And Russia has called all of these attacks terrorist incidents, which I think is really interesting, because if you invade a country and then bombard that country with missile attacks and drone attacks and tank attacks, and then that country fights back and actually sends a couple of drones into your territory, I think it's a bit rich to say that that's an isolated terrorist incident. But obviously President Putin is still referring to this war as a special military operation. So special military operation and terrorist attacks is how it's being billed in Russia. But I think what's been really interesting over the last 24 hours is the US House has now approved its 4-part bill in terms of providing overseas support to ongoing crises. Now, the first of those crises is the Ukraine war, and it's likely that America is going to provide an additional $61 billion worth of support, and that's on top of the tens of billions of dollars that it's already provided. So what we've got here is a huge amount of cash that's going to be given over to Ukraine, along with lots of weapons and other sorts of support. And what that's going to do is prolong this war for a much longer period than everybody really wants, because as it stands at the moment, Ukraine has been losing over the last couple of months because it's been running out of weaponry and it doesn't have enough defence systems to be able to defend itself. The USA is obviously doing the right thing in terms of supporting one of its allies by handing over a huge amount of cash, but it's unlikely that that's going to force Russia to back down and come to some sort of peace agreement. So what we're going to see is both sides being well weaponized, both sides having lots of resources over the course of the next 6 to 12 months. And I think realistically the best hope that everybody has for some sort of ceasefire is actually the drone attacks that Ukraine is launching on Russian soil, because realistically that's the only way that you're going to get the message across to the Kremlin. If some of those oil and gas facilities start getting taken out and Russia sees a significant drop in its export of oil, it's going to lose lots of revenue, and that really is the only way that President Putin will be dragged around the table to talk about stopping this war. So I think the money going into the right areas and funding those drones will potentially accelerate some sort of ceasefire, but it's unlikely to happen at any time in the near future, because at the moment everybody's got lots of weapons, Ukraine's just about to get more weapons, and so I'm sure there'll be a barrage of exchanging all of that weaponry for the next 6 months or so. But two of the other things that were in the bill that was passed by the US House was a $26 billion support package for Israel, which is likely to prolong the conflict that's going on currently in the Middle East. And that conflict, I think, has real potential to cause problems for the global economy, because we've got countries involved that have lots of oil and gas. And if they do get involved in a direct conflict, so if Iran does get drawn in to having some sort of war with Israel, that's very likely to disrupt global oil supplies and therefore push the price of oil up. We could see it going above $100 per barrel. There are some people talking about the fact that it could go up to $200 per barrel. I think that's very unlikely unless we see a major flare-up in that conflict. But alongside the support that's been provided to Israel, there's also a $9 billion package that's being provided to support what's going on in Indochina, and specifically Taiwan is one of the countries that's been named in that package. And I think that's interesting because there's a lot of saber rattling going on right now between China and Taiwan, because obviously the situation is that the previous rulers of China fled to Taiwan and set up their own independent country, which has never been recognized by the current rulers of China. So they say that it's part of the wider China. Taiwan says that they're independent. And the reason that a lot of countries are interested in that is because Taiwan produces lots of semiconductors. So they play a really important role in the world of technology. And the USA has been a long-term supporter of Taiwan. It'll be interesting to see whether or not China does make some sort of advances on the country, and if that does happen, what the reaction is from the USA's point of view. But the fourth thing that was in that bill, and I think this is the most terrifying thing if you're under the age of 20, is that the USA is looking to potentially ban TikTok. Now, TikTok isn't something that I think most of the viewers of this channel watch, because most people are over the age of 35, and in fact, most of you are over the age of 50, and I'm sure most 50-year-olds don't even know what TikTok is, unless you've got children or grandchildren who are constantly on it. But TikTok, if you're not familiar with it, is basically the cure for boredom for all teenagers. If you think back to your youth, when you actually had to watch content on a television set, generally that was the size of a small car, and you had to warm it up before you could actually watch anything. And I'm sure some of the older viewers may even remember watching things in black and white, Laurel and Hardy, and lots of other silent entertainment. Can you believe it? People were watching television with no sound apart from some crazy music that drove you insane, and you had the odd subtitle that would cut in saying, "Oh no, there's a cliff edge coming up." But if you remember back to those days when there was very little broadcast on the TV that you actually wanted to watch, maybe 1 or 2 shows a week at a set time, and you had to sit in, tune in at that particular time, watch all of the commercials that were broadcast because there was no way of recording it and fast forwarding it. If you remember back to those days, there were long periods of boredom because there was actually nothing to do. Okay, boredom is a relative term, and some people may say, well, actually, that was a good thing. I was never really bored. I like to contemplate life. But I know if I think back to my youth, I had long periods when there was nothing to do. It was quite boring. Well, today, children don't have that problem because rather than sitting around thinking, I've got nothing to do, what am I going to do? Let me think of something creative. All you need to do is pick up your phone and then watch TikTok, and it will provide you with an endless stream of short videos that are mildly entertaining, and one blends into the next, and there is no stopping you. Once you become addicted to TikTok, it's very difficult to switch it off because it's a constant stream of mindless entertainment. And that's exactly what teenagers have signed up for. But the USA is really concerned because TikTok is owned by a Chinese company called ByteDance. And despite the fact that ByteDance has said that it's not using any of the data for any spying purposes, it's not providing any of that information to the Chinese authorities and to try and brainwash all of the US citizens, the US government has now said that ByteDance have 12 months to divest of TikTok. They have to sell it to a non-Chinese company so that it can continue broadcasting in the USA. Now, obviously, ByteDance don't want to do that, and the Chinese authorities don't want them to do that either. Maybe they are getting lots of really useful data that they're feeding into their database to find out what US teenagers are watching. And I can tell you that most of the things that they're watching are either people applying makeup or dogs jumping through hoops or some sort of amusing thing like that. There's really not a lot of critical data that you'll find on TikTok. Anyway, the US authorities have given TikTok the order that they've got to sell it, and the clock is now ticking for TikTok. So at some point over the next 12 months, we could see TikTok being closed down completely in the USA. And if you've got children or grandchildren, you need to start prepping now. You need to start preparing them for this eventuality because this is going to be devastating for all of them. This is going to be 10 times worse than when the Beatles announced that they were breaking up, One Direction announced that it was breaking up, or any other references that I can't actually think of where young children were actually put out for a long period of time. TikTok has become the go-to form of entertainment for most young people and maybe some people who are watching this channel. So the USA banning it is going to be devastating for lots and lots of people. And it could be something that could be the trigger point in the US election. Maybe Trump or Biden will decide that they're going to overturn this. They're going to bring back TikTok. I don't think so, because it is seriously tied to potential spying from the Chinese authorities. But you may find that there's a wave of votes coming through from the young people if one of them does decide to save TikTok. Anyway, the overall summary of today's video isn't about TikTok or any of the trivial things I've been talking about. It's actually about the fact that Ukraine has changed its tactics once again in terms of its drone attacks against Russia. It's now targeting energy infrastructure rather than oil and gas infrastructure. And this has really caught Russia by surprise and is going to put further pressure on Russia's defences because they're now going to have to think about covering absolutely everything in Russia against drone attacks. So whether or not they'll be able to stop these drones is unlikely. It's likely that Ukraine will have more success, particularly because they've got another $60 billion of support that's now been signed off by the USA. And also, Ukraine has developed around 2 million drones over the course of the next 12 months, plus the EU has committed to giving it another million drones. So Ukraine could end up having 3, 4, 5 million drones by the end of this year, and it's going to be sending lots of those drones into Russia to hit Russia where it hurts, in its pocket. And I think realistically, that's the best chance that any of us have of bringing this war to an end, having some sort of peace settlement, and getting the global economy back on track. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's episode. It was slightly different. I wanted to mix it up a little bit, introduce a little bit of humour. No doubt there'll be lots of complaints from everybody. If you've got a complaint, then please don't bother sending it to me. I'm not interested. I don't want to hear it. Just watch the videos and be happy.